Hey there. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about McDonald's and how a small hamburger stand in California gradually became something that most people on Earth have encountered in one way or another. It's a long story, and it moves slowly through different eras and different ideas about food and business and the way people live. So get comfortable. There's no rush here. We're just going to trace this thing from the very beginning, all the way through, at whatever pace feels right. You don't need to remember any of it. You can just let it wash over you. So settle in, and let's begin. Picture a small town in California called San Bernardino. It's 1940. The country is just beginning to emerge from the long shadow of the Great Depression, and people are cautious with money in a way that takes years to unlearn. There's a new thing happening on the roadsides of America, though, something that feels modern and exciting even if it's fairly simple at its core. Roadside restaurants are appearing, places where you can pull your car off the highway and get a meal without having to sit down inside a formal dining room and wait for someone to bring you a menu. These places have names like drive-ins, and they work on a simple idea. You stay in your car, a server comes to you, takes your order, and brings your food back to the window on a tray that hooks over the glass. It's casual and fast, and in the America of 1940, that combination feels genuinely new. Richard and Maurice McDonald were brothers from New Hampshire who had come out to California looking for something better, the way a lot of people did in those years. They'd tried a few things before settling on the restaurant business. They'd run a movie theater for a while, and that hadn't quite worked out the way they hoped. But the food business seemed to have something going for it, especially out in California, where the car culture was already taking root in a way it hadn't quite managed anywhere else. California had long stretches of road between towns, and people were getting used to the idea of driving places, of spending time in their cars not just as a means of getting somewhere but as a kind of activity in itself. The McDonald brothers understood that instinctively, or at least they were in the right place at the right time to notice it. Their first restaurant wasn't the McDonald's you'd recognize. It was a drive-in, like all the others. They had car hubs, those young servers who would come out to the car and take orders and bring food back. They served barbecue, hot dogs, all kinds of things. And it did reasonably well. San Bernardino was a decent-sized town, and people liked the convenience of it. But the brothers noticed something about the way the business worked that nagged at them. The menu was long. There were a lot of different items, which meant they needed a lot of ingredients, a lot of prep work, and a lot of staff who had to know how to make a lot of different things. And the car hubs were a whole system unto themselves, with all the coordination and variability that came with any system that depended heavily on individual people interacting with individual customers. What the brothers started thinking about, quietly and over time, was whether there was a simpler way. Whether you could strip the whole operation down to something more essential, something more repeatable, something that didn't require as much complexity in the kitchen or on the floor. They closed the restaurant in 1948, which took some nerve. They let the car hubs go, which was not an easy thing in a town where people had come to depend on those jobs. And they redesigned everything from the ground up. What they came up with was something they called the Speedy Service System, named after a little round mascot with a chef's hat. The idea was borrowed partly from the logic of factories, from the way Henry Ford had organized the assembly line to produce cars efficiently by breaking the process down into small, specialized tasks. The brothers applied that thinking to food. Instead of one cook who knew how to make everything on the menu, they had a small crew of people, each responsible for one specific part of the process. One person handled the grill. One person handled the fries. One person assembled the burgers. One person worked the cash register. Each person did their small part over and over again, all day long, and the whole system moved together like a machine. The menu shrank dramatically. They kept hamburgers and cheeseburgers. They kept French fries. They kept milkshakes. They got rid of almost everything else. And the price dropped accordingly, because when you're only making a handful of things and you're making a huge volume of them, your cost per item goes down. A hamburger at the new McDonald's was 15 cents. That was genuinely inexpensive in 1948. It was the kind of price that made people pause when they drove by the sign. There was also the matter of the physical space. The old drive-in model kept people in their cars, but the brothers eliminated the car hops, which meant customers had to come to a window and order in person. The restaurant didn't have indoor seating in the traditional sense. You walked up, you ordered, you paid, you got your food, and you either ate in your car or you stood outside. It was faster than anything else around, because the kitchen had been engineered specifically to move quickly. The speedy service system was designed so that a finished hamburger could appear at the window within a minute of ordering. That was remarkable. That felt almost magical to people who were used to waiting. Business at the redesigned McDonald's was slow at first. People weren't quite sure what to make of it. The car hops were gone, and there was a period where some customers assumed the place was closed or had changed ownership or something. But word spread, slowly and then quickly, and people started coming. Families especially. The low prices meant that taking your children out for hamburgers wasn't a special occasion but just a thing you could do on a Tuesday evening without thinking too much about the cost. That casual accessibility was something new. By the early 1950s, the McDonald's in San Bernardino had become something of a local phenomenon. The brothers were doing very well. The restaurant was generating real profit on the strength of its volume, and people were starting to notice. Other restaurant owners and entrepreneurs came to San Bernardino to watch the operation and understand how it worked. The brothers were fairly open about it. They gave tours. They explained the system. And gradually, the idea of franchising began to take shape. Franchising wasn't a new concept. It had been used in other industries for a while. But the brothers' first attempts at it were limited in scope. They licensed the McDonald's name and concept to a few other operators in the early 1950s, but they didn't have a particularly systematic way of doing it. The franchisees got the name and a general understanding of the system, but the consistency wasn't quite there from location to location. Some of the early licensees did things their own way, and the result was that the McDonald's experience could vary quite a bit depending on where you happened to stop. This is where the story begins to shift, because in 1954 a man named Ray Kroc showed up in San Bernardino, and his arrival changed everything about what McDonald's was and what it was going to become. Ray Kroc was 52 years old when he drove out to California to see the restaurant. He was a milkshake machine salesman, which is how he'd heard about the place in the first place. The brothers had ordered an unusual number of his machines, a model called the multi-mixer that could make multiple milkshakes at once, and he'd been curious enough about why they needed so many to go see for himself. He parked outside the restaurant and watched the operation for a while, just observing. And something clicked for him. What Kroc saw in San Bernardino was not just a successful restaurant. He saw a system, a replicable system, a thing that could be copied and repeated and scaled across the entire country. He was a salesman, and he thought about things in terms of distribution, in terms of how broadly you could spread a product or an idea. And the McDonald's system struck him as something that could be distributed very, very broadly indeed, if only someone had the vision and the energy to do it. He was 52, which meant he'd been around long enough to have developed both vision and energy in abundance, even if the years had given him a clearer sense of urgency than he might have had when he was younger. Kroc approached the brothers about becoming their exclusive franchise agent, their national coordinator, the person who would oversee the expansion of McDonald's across the country. The brothers were successful and comfortable, and they weren't particularly hungry for the kind of explosive growth Kroc was imagining. They liked their restaurant. They liked their lives in San Bernardino. They weren't quite sure they wanted the complications that would come with a nationwide chain. But they agreed, after some negotiation, and in 1954 Kroc signed a contract with the brothers that gave him the right to sell McDonald's franchises across the country while they retained control of the original restaurant and received a small royalty on sales. The first McDonald's that Kroc opened himself was in Des Plaines, Illinois, in 1955. He chose the suburb of Chicago deliberately, partly because he knew the Chicago market, and partly because the Midwest felt like fertile ground for this kind of thing. California was one thing, but if the concept could work in the Midwest, it could work anywhere. The Des Plaines location was designed from the ground up to replicate what the brothers had built in San Bernardino, right down to the signature red and white striped building and the pair of golden arches on either side of the structure, arches that weren't yet a logo but were just an architectural element, a visual signature that you could see from the road. Kroc spent a great deal of time thinking about the physical design of the restaurants and the uniformity of the operation. He understood something important about what made the brothers' system work. It was the consistency. When you knew that every McDonald's hamburger would be the same size, cooked the same way, in the same amount of time, that reliability became a selling point in itself. People in 1955 were traveling more than they ever had. The interstate highway system was beginning to take shape, and American families were getting in their cars and driving distances that previous generations would have found extraordinary. One of the anxieties of all that travel was food. You didn't know what you were going to get at a roadside place in a town you'd never been to. McDonald's, if it could be made truly consistent, could solve that anxiety. You'd know exactly what you were getting, and it would be the same thing you got at home. Kroc began selling franchises, but he did so carefully, at least at first. He wasn't looking for investors to hand money to, people who would put up capital and then let someone else run the restaurant day to day. He was looking for operators, people who would actually be there, who would run the business themselves, who were invested in it personally and not just financially. He had a phrase for the kind of person he wanted, someone who was in business for themselves but not by themselves. The idea was that the franchise system provided the structure, the menu, the system, the brand, and the operator provided the local knowledge, the energy, the daily management, and the personal stake in making it work. The early years of expansion were not effortless. There were financial pressures that Kroc hadn't fully anticipated. He was paying royalties to the McDonald brothers from every franchise sale, and the margins were tighter than he'd hoped. He was also dealing with the challenge of maintaining quality and consistency across locations that he couldn't personally visit every day. He spent a lot of time traveling between his growing number of franchisees, checking on things, offering guidance, pushing back when standards slipped. He was famously rigorous about cleanliness. He believed that the condition of the parking lot and the bathrooms said something important about the quality of the food, and he held his franchisees to a standard that some of them found demanding. In the late 1950s, a man named Harry Sonneborn came into Kroc's operation and helped solve the financial problem in a way that transformed the business fundamentally. Sonneborn's insight was about real estate. He pointed out that the franchise system, as it existed, was not generating enough money for the corporate entity to sustain itself and grow. The royalties were small. But what if the corporate entity wasn't just a franchisor, not just a seller of licenses and systems? What if it became a real estate company as well? The idea worked like this. The McDonald's corporate entity, or rather a new company Sonneborn helped create called Franchise Realty Corporation, would identify locations for new restaurants, negotiate leases on those properties, and then sublease the properties to franchisees at a higher rate. The franchisees would pay rent for the location in addition to their royalties, and because the corporate entity controlled the lease, it had real leverage over the franchisees. A franchisee who didn't maintain standards or who fell behind on payments could ultimately lose the location, because the location wasn't really theirs. The real estate model meant that McDonald's corporate interests were aligned with the success of each individual restaurant, because if the restaurant succeeded, it paid its rent and its royalties. And if it failed, the location reverted to the corporation, which could install a new operator. This was the move that turned McDonald's from a moderately successful franchise operation into something with a genuinely powerful business structure behind it. Real estate tends to appreciate over time, and as McDonald's expanded, the portfolio of properties it controlled grew more valuable. The company was building an asset base that went well beyond the food it was selling, and that asset base gave it a stability and a financial foundation that a pure franchise operation wouldn't have had. All through this period, Kroc's relationship with the McDonald brothers was growing more complicated. He had the right to expand the brand, but the brothers had the right to veto certain things, and there were growing tensions about the direction of the company. The brothers were conservative. They didn't necessarily want to change things that were working. Kroc had a different temperament. He was more aggressive about growth, more willing to experiment, more inclined to see the entire country and eventually the entire world as territory to be claimed. The two visions were not always compatible, and the friction between them was a steady background presence through the late 1950s and early 1960s. In 1961, Kroc bought out the McDonald brothers entirely. He paid them $2.7 million, which sounds like a large sum and was, but which in hindsight represented an extraordinary bargain given what the company was going to become. The brothers took the money and stepped away, returning to their quiet lives in California. Kroc had the name, the system, the real estate structure, and a completely free hand to take the company wherever he wanted it to go. One of the things he did fairly quickly was rethink the architecture. The original McDonald's buildings had been designed with those arches on the sides, but the arches were not yet the iconic symbol they would become. In the early 1960s, a sign designer named Jim Schindler combined the two arches into a single overhead sign that was shaped like a letter M when viewed from the front. The golden arches as a unified logo were the result of that synthesis, and they became one of the most recognizable visual symbols in the world. There was something about the simplicity and the scale of the golden arches that lodged in the memory. You could see them from a distance, from a car moving at highway speeds, and you knew immediately what they meant. That legibility from a distance was almost certainly a factor in why the symbol worked so well during the great era of American car culture. Around the same time, McDonald's created Ronald McDonald, the clown character who would become the face of the brand's marketing aimed at children. Ronald first appeared in the Washington, D.C. area in 1963, promoted by a local television personality named Willard Scott, who went on to become known as the Weatherman on the Today Show. The connection between McDonald's and children was not accidental. The restaurants had always been priced in a way that made them accessible to families, and the company understood that children who loved McDonald's would grow into adults who loved McDonald's. Building loyalty early was not just a marketing tactic but a long-term business strategy, and Ronald McDonald was a central part of making the brand feel friendly and approachable to the youngest customers. The menu began to expand cautiously in the 1960s, adding items that fit naturally within the existing system without requiring fundamental changes to the kitchen. The Filet-O-Fish was introduced in 1965, initially as a response to the observation that some McDonald's locations near Catholic communities saw a significant drop in sales on Fridays, because the Catholic practice of abstaining from meat on Fridays meant that a menu built around hamburgers wasn't particularly appealing to a portion of the local customer base. A franchise operator in Cincinnati proposed the fish sandwich, and after some initial hesitation from Kroc, it was added to the national menu. The Big Mac came along in 1968, developed by a franchise owner in Pennsylvania named Jim Delegati, who felt that the existing burger options were too small to satisfy adult appetites. The Big Mac became one of the most enduring items on the McDonald's menu, recognizable enough that it's sometimes used by economists as a rough measure of purchasing power across different countries. The Happy Meal arrived in 1979, and it represented a formalization of something the company had understood instinctively for years, which was that children were a distinct and important customer segment who responded to things that were specifically designed for them. The Happy Meal combined a smaller portion of food with a small toy in a distinctive box, and it immediately became enormously popular. The toys became collectibles, and parents found themselves returning repeatedly to collect the whole set. It was a clever piece of design, finding a way to make the act of buying a meal feel like a special event rather than just a routine purchase. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the pace of expansion accelerated dramatically. McDonald's was opening new restaurants at a rate that was genuinely impressive, not just in the United States but beginning to reach outward into other countries as well. The first international location opened in Canada in 1967, which was a natural enough first step given how closely integrated the Canadian and American economies and cultures already were. But the more significant international expansion came later, when McDonald's began moving into markets that were culturally quite different from the United States. The international story of McDonald's is its own long narrative within the larger story. What the company found as it moved into new countries was that the basic model, the fast food system, the consistent experience, the standardized product, could work across very different cultural contexts, but that it worked best when it also allowed for some local adaptation. In some countries, the local beef supply was different from what American suppliers provided, and the menu had to account for that. In some countries, there were religious dietary restrictions that made the standard menu problematic for a large portion of the potential customer base, and the local menus were adjusted accordingly. In India, where beef consumption is not the cultural norm it is in America, McDonald's offered a menu built around chicken and vegetarian options, with a product called the McCafe Tikki that used a spiced potato patty in place of a beef patty. In Japan, the teriyaki burger became a popular local adaptation. This tension between standardization and local adaptation is one of the interesting recurring threads in the McDonald's story. The entire original premise of the business was about consistency, about the customer knowing exactly what they were going to get regardless of where they were. But true global expansion required acknowledging that what people wanted was not identical everywhere, and that a purely rigid menu would close off markets that could otherwise be served. McDonald's managed this tension by keeping the core offerings, the Big Mac, the French fries, the Chicken McNuggets, consistent across markets while allowing individual countries and even individual regions to develop items that fit local tastes and customs. Japan is an especially interesting case because it represents one of the most successful international expansions and also one that required some genuine imagination. McDonald's entered Japan in 1971 through a joint venture with a Japanese businessman named Den Fujita, who was an unusual and forceful personality. He had strong ideas about how to adapt the American brand for the Japanese market, and he approached the task with a kind of focused intensity that ultimately drove remarkable results. McDonald's Japan grew rapidly through the 1970s and became one of the most successful foreign food businesses in the country, helping to establish fast food as a normal part of Japanese urban life in a way that might not have happened otherwise, or at least not as quickly. The 1970s in the United States were a complicated period for the country generally, but McDonald's continued to grow through economic uncertainty and cultural change in ways that suggested the business had found a formula that was somewhat recession-resistant. Fast food tends to do reasonably well in difficult economic times because it offers the combination of a meal away from home at a price lower than a full-service restaurant. When people are cutting back on expenses but still want an occasional treat or a convenient option, a hamburger and fries for $1 or $2 occupies a useful space in the household budget. The company understood this positioning and leaned into it. The advertising that McDonald's ran through the 1970s helped cement its place in the American cultural landscape. The campaigns were warm and inclusive, emphasizing family and community in ways that felt genuinely appealing rather than calculated, or at least seemed to. There were jingles and slogans that lodged themselves in the collective memory. "You deserve a break today," was the campaign of the early 1970s, and it spoke to something real about how Americans were feeling in that period. The country was experiencing stress from multiple directions: economic pressures, the aftermath of a turbulent decade of social upheaval, an energy crisis. The idea that you deserved a small, easy pleasure, that you could give yourself a break from cooking and cleaning and planning by just swinging by McDonald's, fit the moment neatly. Ray Kroc himself remained deeply involved in the company through the 1970s, even as his health began to complicate his day-to-day participation. He had a famously intense personality, and he maintained strong opinions about the brand and its direction until very near the end of his life. He died in 1984 at the age of 81, having overseen the transformation of the McDonald brothers' small hamburger stand into the most recognizable food brand in the world. He was not the founder, in the sense that he didn't create the original concept or the original system. But he was the builder, the person who took a local success and turned it into something global, and his particular combination of stubbornness, salesmanship, and systematic thinking was exactly the right match for the task. The 1980s brought significant menu expansions and shifts in American eating habits that McDonald's had to navigate carefully. The Chicken McNuggets, introduced in 1983, were enormously successful. They were developed in collaboration with a food supplier named Keystone Foods and represented a significant rethinking of how chicken could be served in a fast food context. Chicken wasn't traditionally a fast food item the way beef was. It took longer to cook, it was harder to standardize, and it didn't sit as cleanly within the production system as a hamburger patty. But McNuggets solved those problems by taking chicken meat, processing it into a consistent, uniform piece, and coating it in breading that could be fried quickly and held its texture for a reasonable amount of time after cooking. The result was an item that children especially loved and that families found easy to share, which made it a natural companion to the Happy Meal. The salad appeared on the McDonald's menu in the early 1980s, which represented an acknowledgement that the restaurant's customer base included people who were thinking more carefully about what they ate, and who wanted at least the option of something that felt lighter. This was the beginning of a longer ongoing conversation that McDonald's would have with its customers about health and nutrition, a conversation that would intensify significantly in later decades, but that was already beginning to take shape in the 1980s as awareness of diet and health became more mainstream in American culture. McDonald's Playlands, the outdoor and later indoor play structures attached to many restaurants, began appearing in the 1970s and became more prevalent through the 1980s. They were a natural extension of the family-friendly positioning that had always been central to the brand's identity. If you brought your children to McDonald's, they could eat their Happy Meal and then play for a while, which meant the visit was longer and more satisfying, and which meant that parents might order something additional while waiting. The play place design went through various iterations over the years, but the basic idea of making McDonald's a destination for children rather than just a stop on the way somewhere else proved durable. The 1990s brought both remarkable expansion and some genuine turbulence. The expansion was global in a more complete sense than it had been before. McDonald's opened in Russia in 1990, which was a moment of considerable cultural significance given the Cold War era that had only recently ended. The first Moscow location opened near Pushkin Square in January of 1990, and the lines on opening day stretched around the block for hours. People waited in the cold to have an experience that was, in terms of the food itself, quite ordinary, but that felt like a marker of change and opening to the world. It was one of those moments where a fast food restaurant served as a symbol of something larger than itself, a sign that the country was entering a different relationship with the global economy and global culture. China opened its first McDonald's in 1990 as well, in Shenzhen, and the expansion into China would ultimately make it one of the most significant international markets for the brand. The growth in Asia generally, through the 1990s and 2000s, was substantial, and it reflected the broader economic development of the region and the growing urban middle classes who were adopting consumer habits that included eating at places like McDonald's as a normal part of modern life. The turbulence of the 1990s came partly from a shift in the competitive landscape. Burger King and Wendy's had been established competitors for years, but in the 1990s, the broader fast food category was becoming more crowded and more varied. Subway was growing rapidly. Taco Bell was popular. There were newer concepts appearing that positioned themselves as alternatives to the traditional burger and fries format. McDonald's responded partly through continued menu expansion and partly through a series of promotions that became some of the most successful in fast food history. The Monopoly game promotion, where McDonald's offered collectible game pieces with food purchases that could be redeemed for prizes, became a recurring marketing event that generated enormous amounts of customer traffic. The game worked partly because it was simple and familiar, and partly because it extended the duration of a customer relationship. Instead of a single visit, you were potentially thinking about McDonald's every time you considered stopping for food, because each visit was an opportunity to add to your game pieces and potentially win something. The game ran for years and became something of an American cultural institution, though it also became the subject of one of the stranger fraud stories in modern corporate history, involving an insider at the company that managed the prize distribution who had been systematically removing the winning pieces. That story eventually became the subject of a documentary and later a television series, which is a reflection of how much cultural weight McDonald's had accumulated by that point. Even the scandals were interesting enough to be turned into entertainment. The McCafe concept began to emerge in the late 1990s in Australia and gradually spread globally through the 2000s. It represented an acknowledgement that the coffee market was changing, that Starbucks had demonstrated there was a substantial and growing appetite for coffee drinks that were more elaborate and more premium than a standard cup of filter coffee. McDonald's had always served coffee, but it was basic, functional coffee, the kind you'd get at a diner. The McCafe initiative was an attempt to move up market in the beverage category, to offer lattes and cappuccinos and other espresso drinks in an environment that was still recognizably McDonald's, but that felt slightly more sophisticated in this one specific area. The success of McCafe varied by market, but in many places it was substantial. There was something appealing about the combination of the familiar McDonald's context with a coffee drink that felt a little special. The pricing was generally lower than Starbucks but higher than what you'd expect from a fast food coffee, which positioned it as an accessible alternative rather than a direct copy of the premium coffee experience. In the United States, McDonald's introduced premium coffee offerings in the mid-2000s and they became one of the more successful additions to the menu in recent years, contributing meaningfully to breakfast sales in particular. The breakfast category at McDonald's is worth thinking about for a moment, because it became one of the most important parts of the business over time. Breakfast was added to the McDonald's menu in 1972 when a franchise operator in Pittsburgh introduced the Egg McMuffin, an English muffin sandwich with a round fried egg, Canadian bacon, and cheese. The item was developed by Herbert Peterson, the franchise operator, who had been thinking about how to bring the McDonald's system to bear on the breakfast meal in a way that maintained the speed and consistency that defined the brand. The Egg McMuffin solved this problem elegantly by using an English muffin, which could be toasted quickly, and a ring mold that allowed a round egg to be cooked to a consistent shape that fit perfectly in the sandwich. It was a small piece of engineering, but it worked, and when Kroc tried it and approved it for national rollout in 1975, McDonald's breakfast business began. Breakfast proved to be an extremely valuable daypart for the company. The morning rush, the period from roughly 6 to 10 in the morning when people were stopping on the way to work, was a time when there was historically less competition in the fast food space, because most traditional fast food restaurants hadn't served breakfast. McDonald's moving into that space gave it access to a customer who might not have thought of McDonald's as a lunch or dinner destination but who appreciated having a quick, inexpensive breakfast option. The sausage McMuffin, the hotcakes, the hash browns, the various breakfast burritos and wraps that came along later, all built on the foundation of that original egg sandwich. All-day breakfast became a big moment in 2015. For decades, McDonald's had cut off breakfast service at a fixed time, usually 10:30 in the morning, and customers who arrived after that time were served the regular lunch menu regardless of what they actually wanted. This created a recurring source of frustration, because there was always someone who arrived at 10:31 hoping for a McMuffin and had to settle for a burger instead. The company debated all-day breakfast for years, wrestling with the operational complexity it would introduce. Serving breakfast items and lunch items simultaneously in the same kitchen required managing two different sets of equipment, and timing in a space that had been designed to do one thing at a time. But eventually the decision was made to try it, and the response was enthusiastic enough to validate the operational investment. The supersized promotion of the 1990s and its eventual elimination in the early 2000s is a part of the McDonald's story that tends to be discussed in terms of health and nutrition. But it's also an interesting case study in how a company responds to shifts in public perception. Supersize was introduced as a way to offer larger portions for a modest additional price, which appealed to customers looking for value in quantity terms. For a period it was very popular. But as awareness of obesity and dietary health became more central to American public conversation, the large portion sizes associated with fast food came under increasing scrutiny. The documentary film Super Size Me, released in 2004, followed a man who ate nothing but McDonald's for a month and tracked the health consequences. The film was widely discussed and contributed to a cultural moment in which fast food portion sizes became a specific object of concern. McDonald's discontinued the supersize option in 2004, though the company maintained that the decision was part of a menu simplification effort rather than a direct response to the film. The early 2000s were genuinely difficult for McDonald's in a way the company hadn't experienced before. Same-store sales were declining. The brand felt stale to some customers. The menu had grown unwieldy over time, and the clarity and simplicity of the original concept had been diluted by years of additions and variations. There were concerns about the brand's relevance to younger consumers who were drawn to newer concepts that felt fresher and more contemporary. The turnaround began in 2003 under new leadership, with a strategy that became known internally as the Plan to Win. The focus shifted from growing the number of locations, which had been the dominant metric for years, to improving the experience and the performance of existing locations. There was investment in kitchen equipment that improved the quality and freshness of the food. The menu was simplified and refined in some areas while being thoughtfully extended in others. The salads were upgraded. The chicken offerings were expanded. The coffee program began to take shape. One of the most consequential product decisions of the early 2000s was the introduction of premium salads in 2003. These weren't the simple side salads that had been on the menu for years. They were main course salads with substantial toppings, offered in portion sizes and with quality ingredients that position them as a genuine alternative to the burger rather than just an accompaniment to one. The marketing around the premium salads was notable because it featured well-known personalities and was aimed explicitly at adult women, a demographic that the traditional McDonald's marketing hadn't always engaged directly. The campaign acknowledged that some people had doubts about McDonald's and tried to address those doubts by demonstrating that the menu had more to offer than its critics might assume. The redesign of the physical restaurants was another element of the turnaround. The older McDonald's aesthetic, the bright primary colors, the orange and yellow interiors, the almost relentlessly cheerful visual language, was gradually updated to something more contemporary and calming. Earth tones, wood-look surfaces, softer lighting, comfortable seating arrangements that included lounge areas and booth seating and bar-height counter spaces. The restaurants began to feel less like places you passed through and more like places you might choose to sit for a while. Free Wi-Fi became standard, which made the restaurants more attractive as a workspace or a meeting spot for people who needed a table and a connection. The McCafe coffee expansion in the United States, which happened in earnest around 2009, coincided with the economic recession of that year and proved to be well-timed. As people were looking to reduce discretionary spending without eliminating small pleasures entirely, a latte at McDonald's for a price significantly below what Starbucks charged offered an appealing alternative. The quality of the coffee was generally well regarded, better than the fast food coffee many people had expected, and the McCafe push helped shift the perception of McDonald's as a breakfast and beverage destination as well as a burger place. Breakfast all day. The decision to introduce all-day breakfast in 2015 was part of a period of renewed engagement with the customer and with what the customer actually wanted. The company had spent some time in the preceding years trying to keep pace with every trend in the food industry, adding items that didn't quite fit the system, creating menu complexity that slowed down service. The all-day breakfast move was different because it was responding to a very specific and clearly expressed customer desire, the desire to get an Egg McMuffin at noon, and it was responding with something that reinforced rather than diluted the brand's existing strengths. The delivery era began to take shape for McDonald's in the mid-2010s. The explosion of food delivery services, primarily Uber Eats, DoorDash, and Grubhub in the United States and various international equivalents elsewhere, created an opportunity to serve customers who wanted McDonald's food but didn't want to go to a McDonald's restaurant. Delivery was not a new concept, but the aggregator platforms made it much easier to connect restaurant supply with customer demand at scale, and McDonald's moved to partner with these platforms and make its food available for delivery in markets around the world. The delivery business turned out to be substantial. McDonald's food travels reasonably well compared to many restaurant options, at least for a short delivery window, and the familiarity and predictability of the menu made it an appealing delivery choice. Customers who ordered delivery from McDonald's didn't have to think too hard about what they wanted, because the menu was already known to them. That reduction in decision-making friction is actually a significant factor in why established brands tend to do well in delivery contexts. The mobile ordering and loyalty app took longer to develop into a central part of the McDonald's experience. But when it did, it added another dimension to how customers interacted with the brand. The app allowed customers to order ahead, to pick up their food without waiting in a line, to customize their orders in ways that were cumbersome to do at a counter, and to accumulate points that could be redeemed for food rewards. Loyalty programs are not new in retail or food service, but the digital version allowed for a level of personalization and data collection that traditional punch card programs couldn't match. The data question is interesting because it sits at the intersection of the business strategy and the broader cultural moment that McDonald's now inhabits. When a customer uses the McDonald's app, the company learns something about when they visit, what they order, how often they come, what kinds of promotions or offers influence their behavior. That data, aggregated across millions of customers, is genuinely valuable. It allows the company to make decisions about pricing and promotions and menu development that are grounded in actual customer behavior rather than estimates and assumptions. It also raises questions about privacy and the terms of the relationship between a customer and a brand that are live and ongoing in the culture more broadly. The pandemic years of 2020 and 2021 were a stress test for the entire restaurant industry, and McDonald's came through them in a position that was, relative to many competitors, reasonably strong. The drive-thru format, which had always been a significant part of the McDonald's business, proved especially valuable during a period when indoor dining was restricted or eliminated in many markets. McDonald's had spent years improving the speed and efficiency of its drive-thru operation, and that investment paid off when the drive-thru became not just one channel among several but often the only channel available. The drive-thru as a concept had been part of McDonald's for decades, but it had become more central to the business over time. The physical design of new McDonald's restaurants increasingly incorporated drive-thru lanes as a primary rather than secondary feature. Digital menu boards that could be updated remotely and could display items differently depending on the time of day or the demand pattern became more common. There was investment in artificial intelligence tools that could predict what a customer approaching the menu board might want based on factors like the time of day, the current weather, and the historical ordering patterns at that location, and could surface suggestions accordingly. The AI menu board initiative was an interesting extension of the McDonald's tradition of using systematic thinking to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the operation. It was essentially applying the same logic that the brothers had applied in 1948 when they redesigned their kitchen, the logic of the factory, of breaking a process down into its components and optimizing each one, but now using the computational tools available in the 2020s rather than the spatial and organizational tools available in the 1940s. The through line between the speedy service system and the AI-driven drive-thru menu is a long one, but it's genuinely there. McDonald's stands, at this point in the early 2020s, as one of the most extensively studied business organizations in the world. It's taught in business schools as a case study in franchising, in brand management, in international expansion, in operations, in marketing. Its financial structure, with the real estate component that Sonneborn helped design in the late 1950s, is still the foundation of the business model, and it's still cited as an example of creative financial thinking that turned a modest franchise arrangement into something much more powerful and durable. The company owns or leases the land and buildings for a substantial portion of its locations, even though it doesn't operate most of those locations directly. That means it has a real property portfolio that generates substantial value independent of whether any given restaurant is doing particularly well in a given week. The relationship between McDonald's corporate and its franchisees has evolved considerably over the decades and remains a central dynamic of the business. The tension between what the corporate entity wants and what individual operators want is not entirely dissimilar to the original tension between Kroc's vision and the McDonald brothers' comfort with their existing success. Franchisees have their own interests and their own perspectives, and those don't always align perfectly with the corporate strategy. There are periodic disputes about required investments in restaurant upgrades, about the pricing of items on the menu, about promotional campaigns that require local spending. The Operators Association, the formal body that represents McDonald's franchisees in the United States, is an active voice in conversations about the direction of the business, and the dynamic between that voice and the corporate leadership is one of the ongoing tensions that shapes how the company actually operates. The question of wages and working conditions at McDonald's has become more prominent in public discourse in recent years, particularly in the context of the broader national conversation about the minimum wage and the economic situation of low-wage workers in the United States. McDonald's employs, through its franchisees, an enormous number of people, many of whom are working their first jobs or working in roles that don't offer extensive opportunities for advancement. The Fight for $15 movement, which advocated for a $15 minimum wage, often used McDonald's as a focal point because of the scale of its workforce and the visibility of the brand. McDonald's has responded to these pressures in various ways, including implementing wage increases at company-operated locations and making statements about the importance of working conditions, though the franchise structure complicates any universal corporate policy because the company doesn't technically employ the workers at franchised locations. The supply chain that feeds McDonald's restaurants is its own remarkable system. The scale of McDonald's purchasing power is such that it can shape agricultural and food processing markets in meaningful ways. When McDonald's decides to require a change in how its beef suppliers raise cattle, or how its poultry suppliers treat their chickens, those requirements ripple through a supply chain that touches an enormous number of farms and processing facilities. The company has made various commitments over the years to sustainable sourcing, to reducing environmental impact, to improving animal welfare standards. These commitments are debated in terms of their depth and effectiveness, but they represent an acknowledgement that a company operating at McDonald's scale has a relationship with the natural world that goes well beyond the simple transaction of selling hamburgers. The environmental question is one that McDonald's, like most large corporations in the food and consumer goods space, is grappling with in ways that are genuine but also complicated by the structural realities of the business. The packaging that wraps every burger and every order of fries adds up to an enormous volume of material. The plastic straws and cups that accompany every beverage have been a source of concern and have led to various packaging changes in different markets. The carbon footprint of beef production is a well-documented concern in the context of climate change. McDonald's has set targets related to emissions reductions and has made changes to its packaging and supply chain with those targets in mind. But the magnitude of the challenge is significant, and the solutions are not simple. The plant-based burger moment, which arrived for McDonald's in earnest in the early 2020s with the McPlant burger developed in partnership with Beyond Meat, was a response to a broader cultural shift in which a growing number of consumers were interested in reducing their meat consumption, at least partially. The McPlant was tested in various markets and generated significant attention, though its ultimate commercial performance was mixed. Some markets found substantial demand for it. Others found that the demand didn't justify the operational complexity of maintaining a separate product line. The conversation about plant-based proteins in the fast food context is ongoing, and it reflects a genuine uncertainty about how much the core customer base of a business built on beef is interested in alternatives to beef. What's remarkable, stepping back from all of these specific details and looking at the arc of the story, is the degree to which McDonald's has remained recognizably itself across 8 decades of operation in a world that has changed enormously. The core offering, a hamburger, some fries, a drink, served quickly in a clean environment at a reasonable price, is not fundamentally different from what the McDonald brothers were offering in San Bernardino in 1948. Everything around that core has evolved: the scale, the global reach, the menu, the architecture, the technology, the marketing, the financial structure. All of it has changed dramatically. But the basic promise to the customer has remained quite stable. There's something almost reassuring about that stability. In a world where businesses come and go with increasing speed, where entire industries can be disrupted in the span of a few years, where the things people eat, and how they order them and how their food arrives can shift dramatically in a short time, the persistence of the McDonald's model suggests that there are some human desires that are genuinely durable. The desire for food that's quick and predictable and not too expensive is not going to disappear, because it's rooted in practical human needs that don't change with trends. People are busy. People have children. People have limited budgets. People are sometimes in unfamiliar places and want something they recognize. McDonald's was designed, more or less from the beginning, to serve those needs, and those needs are still there. The Golden Arches, which started as an architectural quirk of the brothers' original building and became a logo, and then became one of the most recognized symbols in the world, are visible in something like 100 countries at this point. They appear in small towns and large cities, in airports and highway rest stops, in shopping centers and standalone buildings. They appear in places that have very little else in common with each other. And in each of those places, they signal something: a familiar transaction, a predictable experience, a specific set of flavors and formats that will be more or less the same as the ones available 2,000 miles away. There's a lot of McDonald's stories still being written. The competitive landscape shifts. Consumer preferences change, slowly but surely. Technology continues to alter how food is ordered and delivered and prepared. The workforce questions and the environmental questions and the health questions don't go away. The relationship between the corporate structure and the franchisees continues to evolve. New markets open. Old markets mature. The company continues to make decisions, some of them good and some of them less so, about where to go next and how to get there. But the foundation under all of that is still the thing that Richard and Maurice McDonald figured out in their little restaurant in California. if you take a few simple items and find the most efficient possible way to make them and you hold to a consistent standard day after day, you can build something that people will keep coming back to. That insight, simple enough to state and demanding enough to execute, is what started the whole thing. And it's still, in the most essential sense, what holds it together. Ray Kroc used to say that he was in show business, not the food business. He meant that what McDonald's was really selling was an experience, a performance of efficiency and friendliness and cleanliness, and that the food was the content of that performance rather than the whole of it. It's a somewhat theatrical way of thinking about hamburgers, but it captures something real about what the company has always done. The presentation matters. The environment matters. The way the transaction feels matters. People don't return to McDonald's purely because the food is the best food they've ever had. They return because it's reliable, because it's familiar, because the overall experience of the visit meets a reasonable set of expectations every time. That reliability, repeated billions of times across a century of operation, is what built the empire. Not any single product. Not any single marketing campaign. Not any single genius stroke of insight, though there were several of those along the way. It was the daily repetition of a consistent experience at a consistent price, in location after location, decade after decade, that accumulated into something genuinely enormous. And in some ways, the most interesting thing about McDonald's is that it doesn't feel enormous when you're in it. You're just getting a hamburger. You're just getting some fries. The familiarity is so complete that the scale of the operation behind that simple transaction becomes invisible. Which is, perhaps, the most sophisticated achievement of the whole enterprise. The fact that something this large can feel this ordinary is not accidental. It was designed that way, from the very beginning, and it has been maintained with considerable care ever since. There's something quietly worth sitting with in that thought. The ordinary, repeated carefully enough, at scale enough, over time enough, becomes something remarkable. The 15-cent hamburger in San Bernardino became the golden arches in 100 countries. The speedy service system became the AI-driven drive-through menu. The two brothers who just wanted a simpler way to run their restaurant became the foundation of one of the most recognizable brands on earth. None of it was inevitable. All of it required decisions, and effort, and luck, and time. But somewhere in there, underneath all the marketing and the real estate and the supply chains and the franchisee agreements, there's still just the basic idea of making something good and serving it quickly and doing it the same way every single time. That idea, unglamorous and practical as it is, has turned out to be one of the more durable things anyone came up with in the 20th century. And if you're listening to this and beginning to drift a little, that's perfectly fine. The story isn't going anywhere. The arches are still out there, familiar and golden, the same in Tokyo and Toronto and Toulouse. The same hamburger, more or less. The same fries. The same small pleasure of a transaction so familiar it barely requires thought. Rest easy. That's enough for tonight.